Well, good morning, all. It's 10:01. Thank you for joining us today. So I'll start with just a quick introduction. First of all, welcome to today's Coffee and Conversation with Meghan Hertel. My name is Brett Ewart. I'm the board chair of the Regional Water Authority. I'm also a supervising engineer with the City of Sacramento for our utilities department. So the Regional Water Authority, for those of you that aren't familiar, is a joint powers authority representing just about 24 water providers serving a little over 2 million people in the Sacramento region with, our stated mission of improving water supply reliability, availability, quality, and affordability through regional collaboration and strategic action. If you want to learn a little more before we get into our talk, or later on, I should say, about the Regional Water Authority, you can, our website is rwh2o.org, and you're welcome to go there and learn about some of the other programs of the RWA. Just a couple of housekeeping items here. First of all, you've already heard, I think the webinar is being recorded. If you look at the bottom of your screen, I think many of us are expert at Zoom by now, but there's a Q&A button at the bottom where you can submit some of your thoughtful questions. We will take the time to answer these as time allows. You'll also notice if it's helpful for you, there's a closed caption button at the bottom where you can get a little more information that way. So now I'd like to introduce you actually to your host for the remainder of our conversation today, and that would be Michelle Banonis with the Regional Water Authority. She is our Manager of Strategic Affairs, leading policy efforts at both state and local levels. Her work here at RWA regards, updates to Bay of Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and which has some focus on the Endangered Species Act, and some decisions on water supply allocations and funding. Michelle has almost 25 years of experience in water, engineering, ecosystem, and law. Michelle brings an incredibly strong technical and regulatory background to the RWA, and we are lucky to have her supporting the organizations. So with that, Michelle, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brad. Really appreciate it. Well, it is my deepest pleasure today to introduce Meghan Hertel. Meghan is Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency, where she leads efforts to implement the state's 30 by 30 conservation strategy and habitat initiatives like cutting green tape. She previously served as North American Director for Land Life and spent over a decade with Audubon, California. Meghan holds a master's degree in environmental science and policy from Clark University and a bachelor's in political science from the University of Florida. Welcome, Meghan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you for some introductory remarks.
Great, Michelle, and thank you so much. And thanks, RWA, for the opportunity to be here this morning. I want you to know I've got my coffee. I'm ready for the chat. And Michelle, you and I have worked together for a long time, so I think this is going to be a really fun conversation. But just to get a little bit of a kickoff here. So like Michelle said, my name is Meghan Hertel. I'm Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at California Natural Resources Agency. For those of you who are not super familiar with all of the agencies of the state of California, CNRA is actually the agency that sits on top of 27 different departments, commissions, and conservancies that have the mission of protecting and caring for California's historical, cultural, and natural resources. So these are departments like Department of Water Resources, CAL FIRE, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and a lot of the conservancies that fund great projects and work on the ground, like the Wildlife Conservation Board, State Coastal Conservancy, and the Delta Conservancy, and many, many more. We like to think about our mission as being one that really ensures that California is a place where people and nature thrive now and into the future. And I've been in this role for about a year and a half. And my role is an incredible amount of fun. I've got a pretty broad portfolio. The main piece of my work is leading California's 30 by 30 initiative. And that is a global effort to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030 to really reverse the catastrophic biodiversity loss that we've been seeing across the globe for the last several decades. Also, like you mentioned, I went to work on our Cutting the Green Tape. For those of you not familiar with that, that is an effort within government to streamline environmental restoration permits and also to make funding for environmental projects faster and easier. We know that we need to do this quicker and at scale to really meet the challenge of the moment. And then, of course, all things biodiversity. So getting to work a lot at the intersection of water, which is one of the reasons I was excited to be here today. Because as we think about a future where we want to see a strong biodiversity component remaining in California, we really also have to think about water because the two are integrated incredibly closely.
Wonderful. Thank you, Megan. So I guess the first question is, what motivates you to do this work? And how does your background, including your time with non-governmental organizations, inform your perspective today?
Well, it's a great question. So early in my career, I came across two facts that I thought were incredibly interesting. And the first one is that you spend roughly a third of your life at work. So something around 100,000, 90,000 hours for the average person. I bet everyone on this phone works a bit more than that these days. So an incredible amount of your time is spent in your career and in your profession. The other thing that I read was this book by Buffett's son, Howard Buffett, called 40 Chances, and it's about farming. But what it really argues is that most farmers, and you could apply this to any professional career, that you get 40 years more or less, but 40 chances to do something, to make a difference, to make it durable. And so it's this juxtaposition of both what feels like a lot of time to invest and also that time is going to go by really quickly. And for me, I have always wanted to spend my time and my career making a difference for the environment in a way that really benefits people. And so I feel this sense of urgency to take advantage of the opportunities we have now to make a change so that we can have a sustainable California going forward, not just for nature, but also for all the communities and people that rely on this place. And as you mentioned, I've had a pretty fascinating career. I think I've worked in almost every sector except military at this point. So I've spent most of my career in the nonprofit sector, over a decade with Audubon, California. I did several years in the private sector, working for a tech startup that did reforestation using carbon markets. And now I'm in the public sector. And, one of my big takeaways from this is that it actually requires all of us, all the sectors coming together to find durable solutions. The issues that we are working on, and this is incredibly true for the water space, are so complex that we actually do best when we can look at public-private partnerships, when each of these sectors brings their strength to the table to try to find common ground solutions and advance those. One of my other key takeaways that I often like to chat about is that don't assume because someone's in a sector that they have some sort of motivation, that they're not passionate about creating positive change. Because I have found incredibly passionate people across all sectors, both private and public, that really do want to see great outcomes on the ground. And sometimes we let our silos and our preconceived notions of different sectors get in the way of actually finding that common ground and being able to work together. So those are some of the things that I have taken from my varied career, but I'm really enjoying this opportunity to work for the state of California right now and for this governor.
Great. Thank you, Megan. So kind of maybe tearing off some of your introductory comments, can you provide some insights on the priorities you're focusing on in the Newsom administration? I know you mentioned 30 by 30, cutting green tape, maybe a little more detail around that.
Sure, happy to. So we are in the last 18 months of this administration. And so we are very much at this point thinking about what outcomes can we get in the time that we have remaining with this administration, and how do we make those outcomes durable and institutionalize them within state government as we move to a new leader of California in roughly a year and a half. So 30 by 30 is one of those efforts. This is a global effort. California was actually the first state in America to sign on to 30 by 30. Governor Newsom executed an executive order in 2020 committing California to conserving 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. It later became a bill, SB 337 from MN, so it is now law in California. And there are 190 countries around the world that have also signed on to this initiative, and a real recognition that we need to come together because biodiversity doesn't know political boundaries, to really work to make sure that we have the plants, the animals, the ecosystem functions that really underpin life as we know it. So both our human health and our economy, right? These are the things that we rely on for agriculture, for industry, for clean air, for clean water. Unfortunately, the federal government also had a 30 by 30 commitment that has been rolled back under the Trump administration, but California remains committed to this goal. So we're at roughly 25% of our land in California and 16.2% of our coastal waters conserved under this. We're about to release our next annual report with an update on it. But in the remaining time that we've got under this administration, we're really starting to look at, okay, what is currently conserved? What types of habitats, what's plants and animals, and where are there gaps? Where are there opportunities for us to invest more to make sure the broad breadth of landscapes that make California what it is are conserved and protected? And how do we make sure those areas are really connected, right? As we think about climate change impacts across the landscape, we know that species are going to need to move not just in elevation, but across the landscape to be able to survive. So thinking about that connectivity model, and freshwater systems and water in general is a key connectivity point in our ecosystem and our habitat. The other piece I'll talk a little bit about is, given the change in the federal administration and their deprioritization of environmental efforts, California has really stepped into that role. So we do a significant amount of work collaborating with international partners, both other subnationals like states within the US or provinces in Canada, as well as other countries like Canada itself, Chile, places like that. So leaning into those cross-boundary connections to share lessons learned, to think about how can we continue to push each other to move things forward while we see changes in federal administration across many of the places in the world. And then one other piece I just want to bring up that we're really focused on in the next 18 months of this administration, and that is the rolling out of the climate bond. So last November, the people of California passed a $10 billion climate bond. We're incredibly grateful for the investment of the public and things like water resilience, climate resiliency, habitat, fire resilience. So we are in the process now of hearing from stakeholders about how we can administer those funds even better than we've done in the past, and hoping to see those funds start rolling out as soon as the budget is approved by the governor and the legislature. So that's a really big opportunity for folks who do work on the ground.
Thank you. So we did get a question in the Q&A, and I think you answered it, but I just want to be sure, because I think we're talking about kind of multiple layers, right? There's California's 30-30, there's kind of the more global 30-30. So the question that came in the chat is from Dave Bolin, thank you, Dave, is how close are we to hitting the 30 by 30 goal? And I do know you mentioned a statistic in there, but I know, again, getting to kind of the layers of this cake, I was sort of wondering if you could expound on that.
Sure, happy to. And great question, Dave. Everyone always asks, well, where are we? What is the count? And I think that's one of the beautiful things about 30 by 30 is it is data driven, it is transparent. So you can go on our website, it's California Nature, and take a look there. And we have everything is mapped, and we've got mapping tools that actually allow you to explore what data is showing up in it. I would encourage folks to go take a look at it. Please do let us know if you have something in your region that you think should count for 30 by 30 that is not currently counting for 30 by 30. The definition of what counts for 30 by 30 is something that is durably conserved and principally managed for biodiversity. So it can have other uses, but biodiversity needs to be one of the top objectives for which that land is managed, and it needs to be durably protected. We need to know that it's not going to get converted into a parking lot or a housing development. So take a look at that website and please explore your region and let us know if we're missing anything. We're always trying to improve our data. Where we're at right now in California was we're at 25.2% on the land side. So that's roughly 25 million acres, right? And then we have got on the coastal side 16.2%. And we'll be seeing an increase hopefully in those numbers as we release our annual report in the coming months.
Thank you, Megan. So we received a question from Justine Fredrickson with the Ukiah Daily Journal in Mendocino County. So Justine's question is, what are 3 things humans can do to enhance biodiversity and habitat, and what is the most important thing we can do?
Great question, Justine. So I get this a lot. How do people help biodiversity? And one of the first things I always say is through advocacy. So asking your elected officials to support policy, funding, or even electing officials that care about the health of the environment and are willing to work on things that advance our ability to protect it. So things like the $10 billion climate bond, things like supporting 30 by 30 in your region and your area. advocacy really does matter. It creates the policy and the funding sources to get the work done on the ground. The second thing that I encourage folks to do is start in your backyard. There is biodiversity in incredible places like Snow Mountain Berryessa National Monument, which is the picture right behind me. But there's also biodiversity in our urban areas and in our backyards. I think about the Sacramento River Parkway and the incredible corridor and wildlife that occur there. There's great tools online for you to think about how to benefit biodiversity in your yard. Things like California Native Plant Society, CalScape, Doug Ptolemy's Homegrown National Parks all give ways for people to bring more biodiversity into the places that you live. And my third recommendation for folks is to bring someone with you. So to talk to your neighbors, your family, your friend about why this matters. For a lot of people, biodiversity isn't a word they say a lot. I say it all the time. It's part of my job. But really, bringing this down to mean something to folks, to understand that the plants and the animals and the systems that surround us really do support life. They support our economy, and they support agriculture, right? So we need to make sure that they're healthy so that we are also healthy. And the number one thing that I ask for people to do is to take an action. I think that's the largest barrier people face is they feel overwhelmed. Like this feels like this big global crisis. How can I do something? Start small, do something, call your elected official, plant a native plant in your yard. Every single action matters. And as you work in biodiversity, think about climate change. They're really the dual crisis of our times. So to address climate change and make sure that we're resilient in the future, you have to save biodiversity. And if you save biodiversity and don't address climate change, we won't make it. And so really working on those two things hand in hand.
Great. Thank you. There's a question in the chat, and I also have a question that I think we can kind of mishmash together. So I think, the question that I had is aquatic habitats need water. And as water availability and temperatures change in the future, how do you think habitats will adapt? Do you see projects in the Sacramento region fitting into this future scenario? And Bruce Camilos in the chat had a very similar question. He said, how do you see your work coordinating with local water agencies like those in the Sacramento region to ensure that habitat objectives and water supply reliability are both achieved? So I think those are kind of on the same track, but I wanted to give Bruce a shout out and make sure that I got to his question.
Thanks for joining in, Bruce, and for the question. And it's a great question, Michelle and Bruce. So the first thing I'll say is that habitats are already being impacted by climate change. You can just look at the fire regime that we are facing in California, where we're seeing higher intensity fires, more frequent returns, and it is changing the habitat on the landscape. You can look in our aquatic systems, right, and see invasive species expanding their ranges because of water temperature changes, challenges with spawning salmon because of temperature changes. So one of the key things that we need to do as we continue to think about how to manage existing habitat and also how to restore future habitat is to make it climate resilient. And so that's really incorporating climate models, thinking about how flow is going to change, how the timing of when water is going to change. Are we going to see water quality adjustments? And really incorporating that into the project design, and then continuing to monitor post-project implementation and adaptively manage those going forward as we learn more about how species and how habitat types are responding to climate change. There's some really incredible work that's happening both on the land and the water side. A great example on the land side is to start thinking about moving species in elevation or in zones so that native species are shifting, helping plants shift as the climate shifts. In coastal areas, you're seeing incredible things like managed retreat using salt marshes or using marsh and wetland habitat to help with sea level rise. So we can both manage habitat and help respond to climate change, but we have to be really intentional about it. And that's going to be one of our goals as we see the investment of the climate bond is when we're investing in habitat projects, are they also bringing in that climate resilience piece? And then a little bit more specifically on Bruce's question about how do we work with local entities? Well, Bruce, all land use is local. It's something we think a lot about. You are making the decisions and managing the resources on the ground at a local level that ultimately impact habitat and impacts the well-being of our communities and people. So our Department of Water Resources, our Department of Fish and Wildlife, and us here at CNRA, we really do look for those opportunities to engage with local planners, local project advocates, to talk about what our statewide priorities and goals are, to talk about where we have funding to invest, and to understand the barriers that you are facing and see if there are things we can work together on to try to address or make easier. And cutting the green tape is a great example of that, right? We heard from a lot of project practitioners, including local water agencies and districts who were doing habitat restoration, that they were like, look, we're doing these restoration projects, but it's taking us just as long to permit that as it does to build a housing facility, right? And so we need something different. And a lot of the cutting the green tape tools that have come online have been in response to what we've heard from local people trying to do the work on the ground.
Great, great. So the next question actually comes in. So this is a prior submission by Ron Greenwood. He's a board member with the Carmichael Water District. He asked, how do changes in federal, and I'm adapting his question, but this kind of gets to something you talked about earlier, is how do changes in federal policies affect your work on state policy initiatives? And how do you see this playing out financially and in the implementation of programs?
Yeah, and Michelle, before we let everyone into this call, I have to admit, you and I and the other organizers of this conference, we were talking a little bit about some of the federal adjustments and just the changes we've had to have in strategy and workload and thinking about how we still get our work done when we are losing federal partners. So a few key things on the federal front. One of the things that we're tracking very closely in California and working on is the loss of federal staff and of federal capacity and federal funding. So roughly 58%, I think it's 48% if I want to be a little bit more exact, of land in California is owned and operated by the federal government. That's a lot of land, right? That's 48 million acres in California. And so as we see the gutting of our federal agency partners, whether that's from a staffing perspective or from a funding perspective, that is going to result in real world consequences on the ground. I mean, we've heard stories already of where our colleagues from CAL FIRE are picking up the phone to call their Forest Service partners about wildfire resilience and preparedness projects, and the phone is just ringing. Right? We're seeing a lot of folks leaving the federal service, and that is going to leave a gap in California. And so we're working with those that still remain in the federal agencies to try to understand where we can still advance work, where can partners come in and try to fill some of that gap. And we're also very worried about the rural economies where many of these federal employees live, or the gateway communities that sit at the intersection of these public lands. So a lot on our side right now is trying to understand what those impacts are, to make sure that our federal partners and federal leadership understand the consequences of those federal impacts, and to come up with contingency plans where we can. The other thing I will say is where we're seeing full scale rollback of things like 30 by 30, which was a federal initiative and now is not. California is trying to step into that space with our international partners where we see that vacuum of leadership. On the climate side, same thing. California remains committed to our very strong climate objectives of carbon neutrality by 2045. We don't have federal leadership there anymore, so California is continuing with that goal, and also trying to lean into some of those international roles so that folks can see that the fourth largest economy in the world and a large part of the United States is still very much driving on these very important goals and objectives. And the last piece that I will add is that we are seeing some pretty significant threats on our public lands in California, our federal public lands, whether that's national monuments or the sale of public lands. And so California Natural Resources Agency is working very closely with a wide swath of NGO partners who are advocating and mobilizing to really tell the story about why these public lands matter, to help explain that these are areas that the public has advocated for, that the public uses, that have tribal partnerships, and lift that story up to federal leaders in hopes that they will reverse or not make decisions that further damage our lands here in California. Michelle, we could probably have a whole webinar just talking about federal changes and the impacts, but know that we are working as hard as we can to both highlight where we are seeing the challenges, to fill gaps where we can, but to acknowledge that the state of California is not going to be able to cover the federal government in all places. And so really asking partners to work with us across all these avenues.
Great, thank you. So I have a question, and you've mentioned, cross-boundary connections with international partners. I love the term cross-boundary connections. I think that's lovely. So I think the question is, how do you see globalization through the lens of conservation?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting to think back at a time when we were still debating globalization really taking off, right? I mean, 20, 30 years ago, and now it is, right? We saw that with COVID. We've seen it with markets, how intertied we are with tariffs. Globalization in terms of conservation is twofold. It's a double-edged sword. There are incredible opportunities that come from it, and there are incredible challenges. So when I think about conservation through the lens of globalization, some of those challenges are the increased habitat loss and extraction that comes from industrialization, increased production, and the increased commercialization, right? How you can call Amazon and basically get anything you want delivered to your door, sometimes within a matter of hours. Really the consumption, the increased consumption that comes with globalization. That's a challenge because that's having a direct impact in the loss of species and habitats and systems that support us. The second challenge is the spread of invasive species. I was just listening to Capital Public Radio this morning and the report on golden mussel and some of the challenges that we have with new species coming to California that will have real impact on our habitat and on our water systems, right? Thinking about how our water delivery systems were often not designed to deal with invasive mussels or invasive species that can actually damage or clog up the system. And then the third challenge that I think about with globalization is climate change. So California has very ambitious climate objectives. We're investing heavily in renewable energy and battery storage, all kinds of amazing things, unlocking the land sector to sequester more carbon and be part of the solution. But climate change is a global problem. And so as we see other countries pull away from climate commitments and increase emissions, right, we in California, just like the rest of the globe, will bear the brunt of those consequences. And so globalization is a challenge in that if not everyone is working on climate change, we're still all going to deal with the consequences. Now let's flip to the opportunity side because there are probably as many, if not more, opportunities that come from globalization through the lens of conservation. And one of them is this global cooperation, right? There are so many lessons to be learned working with other international partners. California has many MOUs with other countries or other subnationals on things like climate and biodiversity. We actually co-lead with Quebec, the High Ambition Coalition. This is a subnational task force that we lead with them that is committed to the global biodiversity framework and achieving 30 by 30. And we just had a call that had, I think, something like 10 different subnational entities on it a couple months ago, where we talked about everything from how do you lift up Indigenous partners and land return to protect biodiversity? What are the communications that you do to try to get this out to the general public? You know, what are the impacts that you're seeing? What are the benefits you're seeing? So some real time savings and knowledge sharing that's occurring at a governmental level because of globalization. There's also the sharing and increased science and data that we're seeing across the world. There are many other Mediterranean climates in the world, just like California. We actually have a Mediterranean Climate Action Partnership that we have with Catalonia and quite a few other places, and are working on science with them right now to understand the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, on water, so that we can look at, you know, the shared science, the shared data across our different areas, and what techniques and tools they're using to respond that we could apply here. We saw great things like this happen during one of our last major droughts when we learned a lot from Australia, right? There was a lot of cross sharing between Australia and California because Australia has dealt with decadal droughts well before we did, and some great lessons learned there. And so those are some of the opportunities that I see coming from globalization, but it is definitely something that is a pro con, right? There are benefits and there are consequences as well.
Definitely. That's a complicated issue. Do have a question from Holger Forst in the chat. And so he's asking, how do you propose to balance preservation with public access and use?
Such a great question. So the 30 by 30 initiative in California has a pathways document, which is our strategy document. So after Governor Newsom issued the executive order, CNRA started on an 18-month public process. This was during COVID, but we did more than 70 tribal consultations. We did regional virtual workshops. We got over 1,000 different comments from members of the public on how California should go about achieving 30 by 30. The result is the Pathways to 30 by 30 document. You can find it on our website, California Nature. And in there, you'll see that 30 by 30 in California has 3 objectives. The first one is to protect and conserve biodiversity. The second one is to address climate resilience and mitigation. And the third objective to your question is to increase equitable access. So these are our three core objectives. I'll come back to that, but I do also want to mention that we have three core commitments as part of that strategy. And that was, we will do the work in a way that elevates equity, diversity, and inclusion, that we will do it in a way that keeps California's economy strong and robust, and that we will lift up tribal partnerships while achieving 30 by 30. But to go back to those three core objectives, so again, biodiversity, climate, and access, the way we think about it is like a Venn diagram. So we've got biodiversity, climate, and access, and you have that sweet spot in the middle where you can actually do all three of them, where you can have public access, biodiversity protection, and be unlocking the ability of the land to either mitigate for climate change or be really resilient for climate change. Not every project or work that happens under 30 by 30 is going to fall in the sweet spot of that diagram, but many of them are, and we look to try to invest public funds in those areas. But we know we will also have some projects where biodiversity needs to be the core objective of it, whether that's because they're sensitive species, or there's not very much of that habitat left, or the habitat needs to be restored and recovered. And so there will be areas where a lot of public access should be limited to allow the species to recover. Just like there's going to be public access projects where the focus should be public access, right? You have a baseball field, you've got soccer fields, and you're going to have climate projects where the main goal should be climate. But really working at the center of that Venn diagram is something that we try to lean into and lift up. The other thing I'll say on this one is that we really recognize how important it is to increase equitable access to the outdoors. The environmental movement historically thought that you needed to take land and set it aside and lock it up and remove people from that land for the land to be healthy. But what we've learned from our Indigenous partners is that humans have long been part of this landscape, and removing humans from the landscape and removing the cultural practices and management practices that many of our Indigenous partners have done since time immemorial has had an incredible consequence. The overgrowth now of our forest is in large part due to the removal of cultural burning and the removal of our Indigenous partners from those lands. And so we are focused now about thinking of how do we reintegrate people with that land, particularly from the tribal side, but also from the human side. We know that getting people out onto public lands and out into nature is really important for human health. It's important for mental health, community uplift. And so we do try to integrate that into 30 by 30 where we can. And if you go on our website, we do also have an access explorer where you can look at what lands are currently counting as conserved under 30 by 30 and which ones have public access, which I think is a really neat tool, because not all of them do. Some of them are private property, some of them are set aside for habitat recovery, but a lot of them actually do have public access, which is really great.
Wonderful. So the next question I have is an adapted question from a submission by Michael Ross, a professional engineer and civil engineering consultant. So the question is, can you explain how you see uses of water, such as those for ecosystems and agricultural or municipal and industrial purposes, working to provide for sustainability and biodiversity? What does this look like in terms of providing public benefit and financial stability? And what are the roadblocks and how do you see us getting past them?
Well, Michael, I have to congratulate you on a very thorough question. So, Michelle, you may have to break them down into the three different ones, but let's start on the first one and how we see water uses across ag and municipal, industrial, and environmental. So, this is a vital question at the heart of modern water management, right? How do we manage all of these varying uses for water in a system where water availability fluctuates significantly? And under the face of climate change, we know will fluctuate even more, and that our systems were built to manage water in a time where we did not see the climate impacts that we see today. And so one of the things we think about a lot here at CNRA is how do we balance across these uses, and how do we think about those opportunities similar to that Venn diagram that I just talked about to advance water management in a way that meets the needs of multiple sources. So some great efforts in here are thinking about integrated water management. Where can we see more efficient use in urban or industrial? Where can we see reuse of water? Southern California is doing some really incredible work in this area that I think Northern California could learn a lot from. And how do we meet the multiple needs of people and the environment? Another thing that obviously has to be on the table is how do we better account for environmental flows? When we built our water system in California, we had a very different understanding of the importance of the environment. Right? This was a time when we thought a drop of water to the ocean was a drop wasted. We didn't understand that that drop of water to the ocean also meant that we had fisheries, right? It also meant that we had clean water systems. So really re-envisioning our system to meet our current modern day understanding of how important water is for environmental flows is going to be something that we're continuing to do and is really important. And there's some really exciting work happening in that space. And the third thing I think about as we look across these different sectors and how do we balance is where do we hit those multiple benefit projects? Like how can we both have agriculture and environmental uplift and flood protection? A great example of this is the work that's happening in the Sacramento Valley with the Floodplain Forward Coalition. This is a coalition of over 30 groups that have been working together for, gosh, Michelle, what do you think, about a decade, maybe a little bit longer? To where it's not agriculture versus fish versus birds versus the city, right? It's really trying to bring that all together. And it's not always easy conversations, and we don't always agree. And sometimes there are trade-offs, but there are opportunities to unlock the value of rice fields for birds and fish, to reconnect areas for floodplains, to make sure the cities are safe from flood flows. So really investing and creating those spaces for those partnerships and collaborations is incredibly important as we look across water uses in those sectors. So next, second question on there was financial
It is,
stability,
yeah. What does
public
it look like
benefit?
what does it look like in terms of providing public benefit and financial stability? And also, what are the roadblocks and how do you see us getting past them?
Thank you. So, when I think about water management across all of these sectors, including the environment and biodiversity, one of the key things that I want folks to take away is that the reason we are pushing for this so hard is yes, because we want to see species that have made California still be here in the future, but also because these systems underlie our clean water, they underlie our flood protection, they underlie our commercial fishing, our recreational fishing, right? There are so many reasons to ensure that we are using water to benefit the environment while also making sure we're meeting our agriculture, industrial, and city needs. So the public benefit is really clear for me of water in freshwater systems and in coastal systems, everything from recreation, cultural values, all the way to supporting our economy and our human health. From the financial sustainability standpoint, water is the driver of our economy in California, whether that's from the agricultural side, the industrial side, or the city. Without water, much of our economy will falter. And so as we think about financial stability for California and wanting to continue to have a robust economy and hopefully an affordable place for California to live, we need to make sure that our water system is reliable, that it's affordable, and that it operates in a way that supports across all of these objectives, including the environment. And that is going to require some investments. It's investments in new infrastructure, investments in new ways of operating the system, new creative ways that really implement nature-based solutions where we can, taking advantage of natural systems like water banks and aquifer recharge, and looking for innovations, but it will cost us money going forward. So I think that's something for us to think about. But the cost of doing nothing is far greater, right? Because we don't want to see a system that collapses either from an economic standpoint or from an ecological standpoint, because the financial costs of that are quite high. So roadblocks that we encounter and that we are thinking a lot about are institutional silos. And I would put those within state government level, and I'd put them between the levels of government, right? We had the question earlier, I think maybe from Bruce, about how do we work with local entities. So those silos are both real and they're perceived. And so, doing the work it takes to reach out to people in the other sectors of government or up and down the government chain to really create those relationships and have those conversations and think about where do we have shared overlap that we can push things forward. Another roadblock that I would cite is just the funding and incentives to get this work done. As we look at restoration projects or water infrastructure projects, these can be very expensive projects. The federal government has long been a partner and funder in these, and we are very worried about the state of federal funding. The state has put significant money into water infrastructure and habitat uplift, but we have local and federal partners that also contribute to this. And so as we lose one of the pieces of that puzzle, how are we going to keep this work going and continue to make progress on projects that need pretty big amounts of money to get done? And then I think the last two roadblocks that I would highlight is making sure we're ensuring equity. You know, California's water system has not always been the most equitable. It was created on a system of people who had power and had money to be able to get that water. And now we're needing to adjust that to consider equity, whether that's tribal partnerships or community water equity. And so bringing more people to the table is challenging. It's not easy, but it's something we need to do to ensure the sustainability of our systems going forward. And then I think if there are any others, well, I should mention permitting, right? Since I work on cutting the green tape, we are working very hard to streamline permitting, especially for environmental uplift projects. But everyone on this phone that does environmental work or water work, I think, has probably encountered a permit that has taken longer and been more complicated than they'd like. Michelle, you're laughing. I wonder how many stories you've got you could tell on this. So continuing to make it a system that helps us get projects done, still protects the environment and the resources that permits were put in place to protect, but doesn't stop the good projects from happening. That's a roadblock that we're all focused and trying to work on. That was a lot of them, but rest assured, all of them we are trying to advance progress on.
Thank you. That was a great answer. So we did have a question come in the chat from Bruce Knowles, and I think, can you give us what's going on with golden mussel? I think folks are concerned about it, and I know it's come up in my conversations and other conversations, so would definitely like to know more on that front if you can offer anything.
Yeah, and I will admit fully here that I am not an expert on golden mussel. So what I would encourage folks to do is please check out our California Department of Fish and Wildlife page. They've got a page on invasive aquatic species, and they've got current information on golden mussel, including information on how to help folks that are recreational boaters and who want to use these waterways. My understanding, though, is that this is something that was found, I believe, last fall, first in the Delta, and the department moved as quickly as possible to try to limit the spread of this mussel. It is quite invasive, is our understanding, that it will clog up pipes and water infrastructure, similar to some of the other invasive species that we've seen here. So we do have a robust monitoring effort. We've got a program working with folks to check their boats, to make sure their boats are clean. We recognize that this is hard on recreation and people who use boats and use these waterways. And so we just ask for people's patience and understanding that the consequences of this are incredible, that if we're not able to stop the spread of this, that it can move out of some of these reservoirs into the main water infrastructure. This is the water infrastructure that moves the water to feed and provide health and human safety water to much of California. So there are major consequences if we don't get ahead of it and try to stop it where it's at. So again, apologies that I'm not the expert on it, but just CDFW has a great website with lots more information on it.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go, there's a question in here that was submitted by Barbara Evoy. She's a stakeholder in the American River region and a former water board deputy director. And so I've adapted the question. How are you engaging with groundwater sustainability agencies to support groundwater dependent ecosystems, or GDEs? And how are you doing that under SGMA, so the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, for those who want to know what the acronyms are? What mechanisms do you think are appropriate to monitor implementation of SGMA plans on GDEs? And what opportunities exist to improve and enhance GDEs and fish habitat with SGMA plans, as well as with projects like the Sacramento Regional Water Bank?
Hi, Barbara. Thanks so much for that great question. And thank you for your service on the Water Board. Really appreciate your work there. So at California Natural Resources, we work very closely with the Department of Water Resources and Department of Fish and Wildlife to guide GSA implementation through the identification, the mapping, and the assessing of the GDEs, the groundwater dependent ecosystems. Michelle, thank you for doing the acronym definition. Feel free to call me out if I run into acronym world. And so some of the ways that we are doing that is through technical assistance. So things like GDE mapping tools, dependent ecosystem mapping tools like the GDE Atlas, reviewing groundwater sustainability plans to make sure that these ecosystems are being considered and they're meeting SGMA requirements. We also have funding that we then actually will distribute to GSAs to help support this work, whether that's Sigma implementation grants. We had funding through Proposition 1 and Proposition 68, and groups like the Wildlife Conservation Board, which is a board under CNRA, has funding for multi-benefit projects that help groundwater and ecosystem recovery. And then the final way that I'll just call out that CNRA is engaging in the implementation of Sigma is really thinking about the research to help continue to adapt the implementation of this going forward, and to have state policies that support Sigma and groundwater dependent ecosystems like the California Water Resilience Portfolio. So setting up other policy mechanisms and efforts that support the solid and good implementation of Sigma in a way that considers groundwater dependent ecosystems. So some of the ways that we are closely tracking to make sure that Sigma fulfills its promise, including protecting GDEs, is through that monitoring and that ongoing assessment. And so a few of the things we're looking very closely at is biological and hydrologic monitoring, right? How is the vegetation doing along riparian ecosystems? How are the wetlands doing that are actually connected and part of these GDEs? What are the flows happening at different times of year, both in-stream base flows and groundwater level management? And species presence and absence, right? You can really learn a lot about the health of an ecosystem through birds, through aquatic species, insects, things like that. So doing this full sense of monitoring, and then unlocking new technology. So really excited about the use of remote sensing, about the use of AI and other tools to help us really track and monitor this biological and hydrologic piece real time. I think the other things that we are paying close attention to is triggers and minimum thresholds, right? So making sure that there are really clear and measurable thresholds by which we know, okay, this GDE is no longer doing good in accordance with the plan, right? So having those set up in advance, sort of like your early warning system, to be able to tell you that things are not heading in the direction so that we can reverse course and work through Sigma to protect these areas before we lose these ecosystems. And then the last piece we think a lot about is really the data transparency and accountability. Like, do we have the ability for the public to go measure the performance, or not measure, but see the performance, right? See how these plans are shaping out and how GDEs are doing. And a great example of this is the Environmental Data Exchange Network, and an opportunity to really make that data transparent for folks who are paying close attention to it, and for us as state agencies that are obviously very much on top of it. And of course, we've got the regular timeline of reviews that happen of these plans. So that's a lot on the monitoring side, but these are big complex systems, and we really want to make sure that Sigma does what it was intended to do and result in sustainable groundwater, both for people, but also for the ecosystems that depend on it.
Thank you. So I'm going to go into something. You talked a little bit about incentives earlier, things like that. And so I'm kind of going to ease into this question and start with an example and then ask a question. So the Sacramento Water Forum in the American River region, in our region, they've completed a lot of restoration projects for salmon and steelhead. Data collected from the rotary screw traps here show that female fish produce more offspring in restored sites as compared to non-restored sites. And it also shows that restored habitat can function as well, if not even incrementally better than non-restored habitat. With that preface as an example, and absolutely no pressure to give our region as the example here, can you share an example of a conservation project or program that quote unquote gets it right, and explain what makes it successful?
Well, I think the Sacramento Water Forum is a great example of a project that gets it right on so many angles, whether that's from the breadth of projects to the community outreach that's been done to the permit streamlining that they've put in place that actually is really advanced. And we're talking with them now about some more opportunities on that. So great example to highlight in the question, kinds of answers the question for me. But another couple ones that have happened in the past year that we're really proud of, and I am going to go out of this region, but I'll bring it back into the region at the end. And one of those is Dos Rios State Park. So Dos Rios State Park is in the San Joaquin Valley. It's the first new state park in over a decade in California, which is a little bit hard to believe, but we're really excited about this state park opening. It opened last year. This is a project that was worked on for years by river partners and a wide breadth of other folks, federal, state agencies, NGOs, tribes. And ultimately, this is a former agricultural area that is being restored to native habitat, reconnected with the San Joaquin River to reconnect it as a floodplain, and providing public access. So there are so many benefits that are kind of come from this. There's the flood protection. There's the habitat benefits of reconnecting a floodplain, both for fish and for bird species and other species like the San Joaquin brush rabbit that rely on this type of habitat. And there's public access. So this sort of gets to that middle of that Venn diagram. And we're really excited to see that project going forward. So that to me feels like one that is getting it right, so to say. And another one that we're really excited about is the removal of the 4 defunct dams on the Klamath River. And I always love to highlight this project when talking to folks, because for me, it tells the story of the resilience of nature. So as hopefully everybody knows, this is the largest river restoration that has happened in the U.S. Just this past year, the last of the defunct dams came down on Klamath River. There are some higher up in the stretches, but it freed hundreds of miles of the river for salmon. And we at the state of California, all of our biologists, we were like, okay, maybe we'll see salmon next year. It's going to take some time for the river flows to reestablish, for all the sediment to wash out. But salmon were back within a matter of a week. And that is just tells me the resilience of nature, that if we can do the right things to remove the barriers we've put in place, to start doing the habitat restoration around this river, to engage the communities from the tribes who led this effort to the agencies, to the private entities that own those dams, we can really see very quick recovery of nature. So those are just 2 really compelling examples from the last year. And then the last one that I will lift up, I already talked a little bit about is this floodplain work. Really excited about that in the Sacramento River. And that floodplain work is made up of numerous different projects, everything from lookout slough restoration all the way up to the top of the river watershed, and really thinking about the system as it operates as a whole and how you do projects all along it in varying land types to uplift species, to make sure we still have agriculture, and to support flood protection.
Lovely. Thank you. So I think we'll have probably time for 1 or 2 more questions here. So the question I want to ask is, the Public Policy Institute of California has advocated for climate smart tools to protect freshwater biodiversity, including the development of contingency plans in the event that our current plans don't work. Does the state have plans to prepare for worst case scenarios, and what might those contingency plans look like?
Absolutely. So want to give everyone a vote of confidence here. The state absolutely has plans in place for worst case scenario and for health and human safety and environmental health. And, we saw some of that implemented. It wasn't that long ago that we faced significant droughts in California, where we had to make some really hard decisions about water behind surface storage reservoirs and reserving enough to make sure we could meet health and human safety needs, and also think about how are we meeting environmental needs in a time when species and people were being really stressed by the lack of water in the system. And so a few of the things that we saw during that time was expedited permitting to be able to get water resilience projects done, to be able to get things done that help the environment and people. We also saw allocation of emergency funding to be able to support things like farmers flooding up wetlands and rice fields to provide surrogate habitat, because we were losing habitat everywhere else. And really thinking about regulatory proceedings for those that were violating rules, right? Making sure that everyone is showing up and doing the best they can under our rules and procedures to be able to manage the crisis. So those are just some of the examples of what goes into some of the scenario planning that we've got in place. But we do have scenario plans both for droughts, for floods, for infrastructure failures. We learned a lot from Oroville Dam. We continue to meet with the community and work up there, but we've come a long way, I would say, in the last decade plus on understanding what the threat of those worst case scenarios are, and really having the plans and the tools in place to be able to respond very quickly. One of the best approaches to that question of like, how do we do this better, is to build the resilience into the system now. And so earlier, the Sacramento Water Bank came up. This is a great example of that. Really investing now in the changes in infrastructure and the tools we need to be able to better manage those worst case scenarios. So thinking about groundwater banking, thinking about reconnecting floodplains to recover species. How do we make our system and our biological entities, whether those fish or habitats, robust enough so that they can weather a worst case scenario better? We still have the plans to put in place when it happens, but that means we need to be doing the work now to make sure we're building resilience into the system and how we operate it.
Right. So there is a question from Jacques Tozer, and he's actually wondering, so with the 30 by 30 initiative, are there any plans to increase it? Like, for example, to 40 by 40 or 50 by 50?
I get this question a lot, and I like to joke because right now my reporting to the governor is to achieve 4.8 million more acres conserved in the next 5 years, which feels like a very big amount of land to conserve in the next 5 years. There are many places that actually have a greater than 30 by 30 commitment. So the Bay Area has a 50 by 50 commitment. Maryland has actually gone with a 40 by 40 and 50 by 50. I should note they have a very different definition than California. California's definition is a pretty high bar when it comes to conservation, that durably protected and managed for biodiversity. Again, it can have other uses, but biodiversity has to be one of the driving stars behind it. And that's a pretty stringent definition. So 30 by 30 is an ambitious leap at that. The other thing that I will say is, 30 by 30 is a number and a framework and a goal. We also know that that is not enough. We know that if we want to see the recovery of biodiversity and healthy ecosystems and healthy systems that support human life, that it's not going to be enough just to conserve 30%. We really need to think about all of the land that surrounds that conserved area that maybe is not durably protected, but is providing biodiversity habitats. How do we go beyond 30% by working in some of those other spaces to really uplift ecosystem function and efforts? Great example would be, we've got incredible agriculture, row crop agriculture, things like hedgerows or cover plants, cover crops in those areas. Those are lands that are maybe not durably protected, so they could be converted to something else in the future. But right now, because of the work of those private landowners, are providing incredibly important biodiversity and climate benefits. And we need to recognize those, and we do recognize those through other state strategies and investments. But knowing that it's not just about the 30%, that we actually need to be working on all the edges and supporting the many different landowners and land managers that are contributing to the broad goal of biodiversity recovery.
Thank you. All right, so I think we're rounding the bend here. I wanted to just open it up, Megan, if you had any closing remarks or anything that you wanted to add at the conclusion of this conversation.
I will just say thank you for the opportunity to be here and chat with you, Michelle, and with RWA. And thank you for everyone who joined on the phone. The work that all of you do on the ground makes a difference for water, for plants, for animals, for the community around you. I just hope that people take away from this that while 30 by 30 is a statewide objective and there's a global goal, it really comes down to the actions of individual people. And that we at the state of California are very much committed to supporting partners, working collaboratively with folks on the ground to advance this goal of protecting biodiversity and ensuring that we have a resilient system for our water management going forward in the future. And so just a big thank you to everyone for the work that you do, and encouragement to go out there and take that one action if you aren't already. And please do follow up with any additional questions that you might have.
Excellent. Megan, just thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate your insights. This was a really great and engaging conversation. You're so well versed. Just really, really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody who joined, everybody who submitted questions, for joining the Regional Water Authority Coffee and Conversation. And with that, we will conclude this webinar. Thank you, everybody, and have a really great day.
Thanks all.